Picture this. You're standing in a massive stadium and every single human being on Earth is lined up in front of you, all 8 billion of us. And as you walk along this impossible line, you notice something remarkable. The colors, from the deepest browns found in equatorial Africa to the pale pinks of Scandinavia, from the golden ochres of East Asia to the warm olives of the Mediterranean. It's like watching a sunset stretched across humanity itself. Every possible shade, every subtle gradation, all belonging to the exact same species. Now here's the question that should keep you awake. Except you're probably trying to fall asleep, so maybe it's the question that should gently occupy your mind as you drift off. How did this happen? How did one single species develop every conceivable tone of human skin in what amounts to evolutionary eye blink? We're talking roughly 100,000 years, maybe less. That's nothing. That's 4,000 generations. Chimpanzees have been around for millions of years and barely vary in appearance. Gorillas, same thing. But humans? We look like we've been running a planetary experiment in pigmentation. And we have been. Except nobody planned it. Nobody designed it. It just happened. Naturally, inevitably, beautifully. For most of human history, skin color has been catastrophically misunderstood. It's been used to divide people, to justify horrific treatment, to build entire systems of oppression based on something that turns out to be as meaningful as hair color or height. Just another trait shaped by environment and time. But the real story, the scientific story, is so much more elegant than any of the nonsense we've invented about it. Because skin color isn't random, it's not arbitrary. It's one of the most perfect examples of human adaptation we have. It's a biological solution to a complex problem, and that problem is written in ultraviolet light, in vitamin D deficiency, in the chemistry of folate molecules breaking down under solar radiation. It's about survival in every climate zone on Earth, from the equator to the Arctic Circle. And if you want to dive even deeper into these kinds of prehistoric secrets, the hidden stories written in our biology and deep history, we've just released a book all about it over at sleepytimehistory.com. It's full of these kinds of mysteries that connect us to our ancient past. The journey we're about to take goes back to Africa, back to those 1,280 survivors we just talked about. It follows humans as they spread across continents, as they walked into blazing deserts and frozen tundras, as their bodies adapted in real time to challenges their ancestors never faced. We're going to explore the genetics, sure, but also the surprising role of culture, diet, and even sexual selection. Because skin color isn't just one story. It's dozens of stories happening simultaneously across thousands of years. And the most amazing part? It happened fast. Incredibly, almost impossibly fast. So let's go back, way back, before anyone left Africa, before there was anywhere else to go. Around 300,000 years ago, give or take, the earliest members of our species were living in Africa, not in one place. Africa is enormous, about 3 times the size of the continental United States, and early humans were scattered across vast stretches of it. Some along coastlines where they could harvest shellfish and seabirds, others in the dense forests of what's now Central Africa. Still others in the grasslands and savannas, following herds, learning to hunt, learning to survive in open country where you're both predator and prey. The landscape was more varied than most people imagine. This wasn't just endless savanna dotted with acacia trees, though that existed too. There were mountain ranges, river valleys, seasonal wetlands that appeared and disappeared with the rains. There were places that got drenched year-round and places that went months without water. Places where you could hide in dense vegetation, and places where the horizon stretched empty in every direction. And in all these environments, under the fierce equatorial sun, our ancestors almost certainly had dark skin. This isn't speculation. The genetic evidence is overwhelming. When you trace back the ancestry of modern humans using mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome analysis, when you look at the deeply rooted lineages like the San people of southern Africa or the Mbuti forest dwellers, you find genetic markers associated with high melanin production. The kind of melanin that produces dark brown skin. Melanin. That's the molecule we need to understand. It's actually a family of molecules, a complex collection of pigments produced by specialized cells called melanocytes that sit in the bottom layer of your skin. When ultraviolet radiation hits your skin, these cells kick into action, producing melanin that migrates upward, creating a protective barrier against further UV damage. There are two main types. Eumelanin, which is brown to black, provides excellent UV protection, and pheomelanin, which is red to yellow, and actually provides very little protection at all. Everyone has both types, but the ratio determines your baseline color. High eumelanin, dark brown to black skin. More pheomelanin in the mix. Lighter brown, olive, or reddish tones. Very little of either. The pale pinks and creams of northern populations. Think of melanin as nature's sunscreen, because that's exactly what it is. UV radiation doesn't just cause sunburn, though it does that too. It breaks down folate, a B vitamin that's absolutely critical for DNA synthesis and cell division. During pregnancy, folate deficiency causes devastating neural tube defects. In everyone, it affects fertility, sperm production, the ability to heal and fight infection. Under the intense UV radiation near the equator, unprotected light skin would have been a death sentence. Not immediately, not dramatically, but statistically. Over generations, individuals with insufficient melanin protection would have fewer healthy children. They'd suffer more miscarriages, more birth defects, more fertility problems. Natural selection doesn't care about the mechanism. It only cares about outcomes, and the outcome was clear: dark skin or reproductive failure. So our African ancestors evolved high melanin production. Deep brown to black skin that could withstand the UV assault of equatorial sunlight. This was the original canvas, the baseline from which everything else would eventually diverge. But here's where it gets interesting. Even within Africa, there was variation. The idea that all Africans had identical skin tone before anyone left the continent is wrong. The San people of the Kalahari have slightly lighter skin than many West African populations. The Pygmy peoples of Central African forests show different pigmentation patterns than pastoralists in East Africa. Some of this variation is ancient, possibly predating the migration out of Africa entirely. Why? Because even within Africa, UV exposure varies dramatically. Someone living in the dense forests of the Congo Basin, where the tree canopy blocks much of the direct sunlight, faces different UV pressure than someone living in the open grasslands of the Serengeti. The former might benefit slightly from lighter skin that can produce vitamin D more efficiently in limited sunlight. The latter needs maximum protection against constant solar exposure. This means human skin color was already variable before we went anywhere, already responding to local conditions, already fine-tuning the balance between UV protection and vitamin D production, even within our home continent. The genetic studies bear this out. Analysis of pigmentation genes in African populations shows remarkable diversity, multiple genetic variants affecting skin tone, each with its own history and geographic distribution. Some of these variants are extremely ancient, perhaps dating back hundreds of thousands of years. Others are more recent, emerging as populations adapted to specific African environments. So when we talk about the original canvas, we're not talking about a single uniform color. We're talking about a range of dark browns and blacks, already modulated by local environmental pressures, already beginning the process that would eventually paint humanity in every shade imaginable. This was the starting point. dark-skinned humans scattered across Africa adapted to high UV environments, carrying in their genes the potential for everything that would come next. UV radiation is a destroyer, not dramatically, not all at once, but molecule by molecule, cell by cell. When ultraviolet light penetrates skin, it doesn't just cause the immediate damage we recognize as sunburn. It triggers a cascade of molecular destruction that can affect some of the most fundamental processes in your body. And the most vulnerable target is a vitamin most people have barely heard of: folate. Vitamin B9, a compound so essential to life that without it, cells simply can't divide properly. Your body needs folate to synthesize DNA, to repair damaged genetic material, to produce healthy red blood cells. During pregnancy, it's absolutely critical for neural tube development in the fetus. The brain, the spinal cord, the entire nervous system depends on adequate folate during those first crucial weeks of development, and UV radiation destroys it. Rapidly, efficiently, systematically. The mechanism wasn't fully understood until relatively recently. In the 1970s and 80s, researchers began noticing something strange. People with light skin living at high altitudes or spending lots of time in intense sunlight often showed depleted folate levels in their blood. At first, nobody connected it to UV exposure specifically. But then came the control studies. When you expose blood plasma to UV radiation, folate levels plummet. Within hours, a significant percentage breaks down into inactive compounds. The more intense the UV, the faster the destruction. This wasn't just laboratory curiosity. This was a survival problem. For women of childbearing age living under the equatorial sun, folate depletion could mean disaster. Neural tube defects like spina bifida and anencephaly, conditions where the brain and spinal cord fail to develop properly. These aren't minor complications. They're devastating, often fatal birth defects that occur when folate levels drop during the first trimester, sometimes before a woman even knows she's pregnant. But the consequences extend beyond pregnancy. In men, folate deficiency affects sperm production and quality. In everyone, it impairs the immune system, slows wound healing, interferes with the constant cellular turnover that keeps your body functioning. Over evolutionary time, individuals who couldn't maintain adequate folate levels would have significantly reduced reproductive success. Enter melanin, that complex molecule produced by melanocytes in the deepest layer of your skin. It doesn't just absorb UV radiation, it dissipates it as harmless heat, preventing that destructive energy from penetrating deeper into tissues where it could wreak molecular havoc. Think of melanin-rich skin as a sophisticated radiation shield, tuned specifically to the wavelengths that cause the most biological damage. The more melanin packed into your skin, the more UV gets intercepted before it can reach the folate circulating in your blood vessels. For populations living under intense equatorial sunlight, this protection wasn't optional. It was the difference between healthy children and reproductive failure. This is what Nina Jablonski and George Chaplin figured out in the early 2000s. Jablonski, an anthropologist and paleobiologist at Penn State, had been puzzling over skin color variation for years. The old explanations didn't quite work. Some researchers thought dark skin was just about preventing sunburn or skin cancer. But those conditions typically affect people after their reproductive years. Natural selection doesn't care much about what happens to you after you've already had children. Folate was different. Folate affected reproduction directly, immediately in every generation. Chaplin, a geographer, brought another crucial piece to the puzzle. He'd been studying UV radiation patterns across the globe, mapping how solar intensity varies with latitude, altitude, cloud cover, and seasonal patterns. When they combined their expertise, the correlation was stunning. Plot human skin color on a map. Now overlay UV radiation intensity. The match is nearly perfect. Populations living in high UV environments near the equator almost universally have dark skin. Populations in low UV environments at high latitudes have light skin. And populations in intermediate zones show intermediate pigmentation. This wasn't coincidence. This was evolution responding to a specific, measurable environmental pressure. Jablonski and Chaplin could actually predict the skin color of indigenous populations based solely on UV levels. Their model worked across continents, across different human populations that had been separated for tens of thousands of years. But here's what makes the folate hypothesis so compelling. It explains not just why dark skin evolved in Africa, but why it's been maintained so consistently in equatorial populations worldwide. Populations that migrated to tropical regions in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Melanesia. They all retained or re-evolved dark pigmentation, even after their ancestors had spent thousands of years at higher latitudes. Natural selection was relentless. Move to a high UV environment without adequate melanin protection, and within a relatively small number of generations, your population either darkens or suffers reduced reproductive success, and potentially gets replaced by populations better adapted to the conditions. This was the bargain, the ultraviolet bargain. Live under intense solar radiation, and you need a shield. The best shield available was melanin, lots of it, densely packed in your skin cells, present from birth, constantly renewed as your skin regenerates. Our early African ancestors didn't choose dark skin. They inherited it from hominin populations that had been living under the African sun for millions of years. Long before Homo sapiens appeared, our evolutionary lineage had already solved the UV problem. Australopithecines, Homo erectus, the various archaic humans that came before us, they almost certainly had dark pigmentation too. Because the alternative was watching your children born with devastating defects, struggling with fertility, fighting infections your body couldn't properly heal. The alternative was evolutionary extinction. Dark skin wasn't just an adaptation. It was a requirement, the entry price for living under the sun that birthed our species. And for hundreds of thousands of years, it remained constant, unchanging, universal among our ancestors, until some of them started walking away from the equator and into a completely different kind of survival problem. The same sun that threatened to destroy folate was also keeping humans alive in a completely different way. And when our ancestors began migrating away from the equator into territories with weaker, more seasonal sunlight, they walked straight into a trap that had been waiting for them since the beginning. UV radiation doesn't just damage, it also creates. Specifically, it creates vitamin D. When UVB photons, a particular wavelength of ultraviolet light, penetrate your skin, they trigger a chemical reaction in a cholesterol compound called 7-dehydrocholesterol. This reaction converts it into previtamin D3, which then transforms into vitamin D3, the form your body can actually use. It's an elegant piece of biochemistry, refined over millions of years of vertebrate evolution. Reptiles do it. Birds do it. Mammals do it. We do it. And we absolutely need to do it. Vitamin D isn't really a vitamin in the traditional sense. It's more like a hormone, this signaling molecule that affects hundreds of genes throughout your body. It regulates calcium absorption, which means it's essential for bone formation and maintenance. Without adequate vitamin D, children develop rickets, a devastating condition where bones become soft and deformed, legs bowing under the body's own weight, ribs becoming malformed, growth stunted. Adults without sufficient vitamin D develop osteomalacia, a similar softening of bones that leads to fractures, chronic pain, muscle weakness. But the effects go far beyond bones. Vitamin D plays critical roles in immune function, helping your body fight off infections. It affects reproductive health, pregnancy outcomes, maybe even brain development and function. Populations with chronic vitamin D deficiency show higher rates of infectious disease, reduced fertility, increased infant mortality. In evolutionary terms, vitamin D deficiency is a death sentence. Maybe not immediate, maybe not dramatic, but relentless. Generation after generation of children who don't grow properly, adults who break bones easily, pregnant women whose bodies can't support healthy fetal development, populations constantly weakened by infections they should be able to fight off. For hundreds of thousands of years, this wasn't a problem for our African ancestors. The equatorial sun provided more than enough UVB radiation to maintain vitamin D production, even through the protective shield of melanin-rich dark skin. The evolutionary equation was straightforward. Make enough melanin to protect folate, let enough UV through to maintain vitamin D synthesis. Dark skin struck this balance perfectly in high UV environments. Then came the migrations, not the final great dispersal 60,000 years ago, but the earlier movements. Archaic humans, probably Homo heidelbergensis, began expanding out of Africa maybe 600,000 years ago or more. Some populations pushed into the Middle East, then into Europe. Others moved east into Asia. They were following animals, tracking resources, exploring new territories as climate fluctuations opened and closed different migration routes. And they encountered something their genetic programming hadn't prepared them for. Weaker sun. Dramatically weaker. Latitude changes everything about how sunlight reaches the Earth's surface. At the equator, the sun passes almost directly overhead, meaning its rays travel through less atmosphere and strike the ground at a steep angle, maximizing intensity. Move toward the poles, and the sun stays lower in the sky. Its rays pass through more atmosphere, getting scattered and absorbed before reaching the surface. The angle becomes oblique, spreading the same amount of energy over a larger area. The UVB that triggers vitamin D synthesis is particularly vulnerable to atmospheric interference. It gets absorbed by ozone, scattered by air molecules, blocked by clouds. By the time you reach 50 degrees north latitude, roughly the level of London or southern Canada, winter sunlight contains almost no UVB at all. Even summer levels are a fraction of what equatorial populations experience year-round. Picture those early migrants encountering northern Europe for the first time, maybe 400,000 years ago. They're adapted for African sun, carrying the melanin-rich skin their ancestors had maintained for millions of years. The summers might have been manageable, long daylight hours, sun high enough to trigger some vitamin D production. But the winters at high latitudes aren't just cold, they're dark. The sun rises late and sets early. Cloud cover dominates for weeks at a time. Even at midday, the sun barely clears the horizon, its weak rays slanting through atmosphere thick enough to filter out most UVB. For populations dependent on sunlight for vitamin D synthesis, this was a physiological crisis. You can't store vitamin D indefinitely. Your body maintains reserves, but they deplete over months of minimal production. By late winter, populations with inadequate sun exposure would have been facing severe deficiency. Children developing rickets, unable to grow properly, adults with weakened bones, compromised immune systems facing whatever infections winter brought. Pregnant women unable to provide adequate calcium for fetal bone development. This was the dilemma. The vitamin D dilemma, the flip side of the UV equation that had shaped human skin color for so long. Too much UV destroys folate. Too little UV means no vitamin D. And human populations expanding into new latitudes were suddenly facing the wrong side of that calculation. Natural selection doesn't wait around. It responds to immediate survival pressures with whatever genetic variation happens to be available. And in this case, the variation was already present. Random mutations that reduced melanin production, that made skin lighter, that allowed more UVB to penetrate and trigger vitamin D synthesis. In Africa, under intense equatorial sun, these mutations would have been disadvantageous. Light skin means folate destruction, birth defects, reduced reproductive success. Natural selection would have weeded them out quickly. But in northern latitudes, the equation flipped. Suddenly, lighter skin meant better vitamin D production during those critical winter months, better bone health, stronger immune function, healthier pregnancies. The individuals carrying these lighter skin variants would have had more surviving children. Those children would inherit the variants and pass them on. Generation after generation, the population would lighten not through conscious choice or cultural preference, but through the simple mathematics of differential survival. This was evolution in real time, populations adapting to new environments not over millions of years, but over thousands, maybe tens of thousands. The archaeological and genetic evidence suggests that significant skin lightening happened relatively quickly, once human populations established themselves in low UV environments. And here's the elegant part. The trade-off resolved itself geographically. You don't need one solution for all humanity. You need skin color tuned to local UV levels, dark skin near the equator for folate protection, light skin at high latitudes for vitamin D production, intermediate shades in intermediate zones, striking the perfect balance between too much UV and too little. Human skin color became a biological barometer, precisely calibrated to the sun overhead, and it would prove to be one of the fastest, most dramatic adaptations in recent human evolution. The vitamin D dilemma set the stage, but it was the next act that turned skin color from a local adjustment into a global experiment. For most of our history, our species, true anatomical modern humans, was an African story. Even after modern humans appeared, perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, they stayed home for a long time. Populations shifted around the continent, exploring new niches, dealing with droughts, rivers changing course, grasslands turning to forest and back again. But Africa was still the center of gravity. Then, somewhere between about 70,000 and 100,000 years ago, a few small groups did something that would change the face of the planet. They walked away, not all at once, not in a single heroic march, more like a slow leak along the edges of a continent. Family groups following coastline, game trails, river valleys, moving a few days' walk at a time, then settling for a generation or two, then moving again when resources thinned or the climate shifted. Genetic evidence, especially from mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes, suggests that all non-African humans alive today descend from one or a handful of these early expansions, probably somewhere around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. There were earlier pulses of modern humans out of Africa. Archaeology in places like Israel hints at modern human presence 100,000 years ago or more. But those early pioneers seem not to have left lasting lineages. Their traces fade. The main wave, the one that seeded the rest of the world, comes later. Imagine standing on the shores of Northeast Africa around 70,000 years ago. Across a narrow stretch of water lies the Arabian Peninsula. At certain times in the Ice Age cycle, sea levels drop, coastlines extend, and what today looks like a formidable barrier shrinks to a few manageable crossings. Maybe you can see land on the other side. Maybe you hear stories of it from relatives who live a few valleys away. At some point, someone crossed. One important pathway, supported by both genetics and archaeology, hugs the southern edge of the Old World, from Africa into Arabia, along the coasts of the Indian Ocean, through what are now Yemen and Oman, skirting the dry interior deserts by staying near the food-rich shores, then eastward, into the Indian subcontinent, and from there onto Southeast Asia and eventually Australia. This is often called the Southern Coastal Route. It might sound like a gentle beach walk, but in reality it was a gauntlet of shifting climates and unfamiliar ecosystems. mangrove swamps, monsoon-drenched coasts, coral reefs and tidal flats, tropical storms that could erase entire settlements overnight. Yet for a species already skilled at exploiting fish, shellfish, seaweed, and coastal resources, this route offered a continuous ribbon of opportunity. Stone tools and shell middens along these ancient shorelines hint at the passage. Simple campsites, hearths, heaps of discarded shells, characteristic tool styles that look like African technologies transplanted into new lands. How fast did this coastal wave move? The dates are astonishing. By around 65,000 years ago, modern humans are present in Australia. That means that within maybe 5,000 to 10,000 years of leaving Africa, a blink in evolutionary terms, some descendants had already traversed thousands of miles, learned to cross open water, and adapted to completely alien environments. Think about the environments along that route. Blistering coastal deserts in Arabia, where fresh water existed only in scattered springs. Lush but dangerous tropical forests in India and Southeast Asia, full of parasites, venomous animals, and unfamiliar diseases. Open savannas and inland plains, then the dry interior of Australia, alternating with temperate coasts and strange marsupial megafauna. Every step brought different sunlight, different foods, different dangers. Each new region favored slightly different solutions, different combinations of genes that helped people thrive there. And the groups doing this exploring weren't huge nations. They were small, dozens, maybe a few hundred people at most, pushing into a new region at any one time. Small founding groups create something powerful in evolutionary terms: founder effects. When only a few individuals give rise to a future population, they carry with them only a slim slice of the genetic diversity from their parent group. It's like taking a teaspoon of water from a vast lake and starting a new pond with just that. Whatever variants happen to be in that teaspoon, by pure chance, become the raw material for all future evolution in the pond. Genes for slightly lighter or darker skin, genes that affect hair texture, sweat gland density, fat storage, immune response. If a founding group happens, by chance, to include more copies of a rare variant, that variant can quickly become common in the new population, not because it's better, but because it was there at the beginning. Then, once the new population is isolated, separated by distance, deserts, mountains, or oceans, another force gets to work: genetic drift. Random fluctuations in gene frequencies, generation after generation, simply because in small populations chance matters. One person with a particular variant has 3 children, another with a different variant has none. A drought wipes out a valley where one gene was common, but spares a neighboring valley where a different gene was more frequent. Drift, founder effects, and natural selection all interacting in small scattered groups across a rapidly expanding front of human occupation. This is the engine that would reshape human appearance in a geological heartbeat. While one branch of this great dispersal raced along the southern coasts, others took more northerly routes. Some moved out of Africa into the Levant, the region that includes modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, along the Sinai land bridge. From there, they followed river systems and animal migrations into the heart of Eurasia, northwest, into what would become Europe, through the bottlenecks of Anatolia and the Balkans, northeast through the Iranian plateau and Central Asia, skirting mountain ranges like the Zagros and the Hindu Kush, eventually fanning out toward Siberia and, much later, into the Americas. Each branch encountered its own set of environments: dry interior deserts like the Arabian Rub al-Khali and the Iranian plateau, where midday sun could cook unprotected skin, and water scarcity forced changes in behavior, clothing, and shelter. Dense tropical forests in South and Southeast Asia, where canopy cover filtered UV light, Humidity soaked everything, and infectious diseases, malaria, dengue, countless parasites, posed constant threats. High-altitude plateaus like the Tibetan region and parts of the Ethiopian highlands, where air is thin, UV levels are paradoxically intense because of the reduced atmosphere, and cold nights alternate with fierce daytime sun. Frozen tundra and steppe close to the Arctic, in Siberia, and later northern Europe, where for months of the year the sun barely skimmed the horizon. Snow and ice reflected what little light there was, and winter meant profound vitamin D scarcity. Cloud-shrouded northern coastlines, washed by cold oceans and low gray skies, where even summer could be dim and cool, and seasonal extremes in day length rewrote the daily rhythms of life. Viewed from a satellite, it would have looked like this. Small sparks of human presence flickering outward from Africa in many directions, occasionally winking out, sometimes joining, sometimes bypassing whole regions and leaping ahead when conditions allowed. Over tens of thousands of years, those sparks stitched together into a nearly continuous web, wrapping around the globe. By around 45,000 to 50,000 years ago, modern humans are firmly established across much of Eurasia. They share the continent with Neanderthals and Denisovans, sometimes competing, sometimes interbreeding. By 40,000 years ago, Europe is populated by our species. By roughly 30,000 to 20,000 years ago, humans have reached the cold edges of Siberia. Eventually, during a later chapter of this ongoing movement, some will cross into the Americas, likely via Beringia, the land bridge that once connected Siberia and Alaska, somewhere before 15,000 years ago. From the perspective of evolution, this is warp speed. A species that for millions of years had been confined to one continent spreads to occupy every major landmass except Antarctica in less than 60,000 years. In geological time, that's not even the sweep of a second hand. It's the ticking of a single second. Along the way, skin color is constantly being recalibrated by the same forces we've been tracing. Folate protection near the equator, vitamin D pressure at high latitudes, founder effect setting starting conditions, genetic drift pushing populations down different paths, local diets, rich in fish here, cereal grains there, modifying how strong the selection pressures are. But the key thing to hold in mind is this. The humans doing all this migrating are still remarkably similar under the surface. They come from the same bottlenecked ancestry. They carry much of the same genetic toolkit. What changes as they fan out across deserts, jungles, mountains, and ice is which tools get used most, which dials get turned up or down in response to local conditions. In the next part of the story, we'll zoom in on those dials, the genes themselves, and watch how a surprisingly small number of molecular switches helped paint the full spectrum of human skin tones across this rapidly expanding map. When we talk about the genes for skin color, it sounds simple. But there's a dark skin switch and a light skin switch hidden somewhere in the genome. Reality is messier and much more interesting. Skin color is what geneticists call a polygenic trait. Not one gene, but many. Each one nudging the final outcome a little lighter or a little darker, a little warmer or cooler in tone. Think of a sound mixer, not a light switch. Dozens of sliders, some big, some tiny, all moving up and down over thousands of generations. The reason humans don't come in a few neat color categories, but in a continuous gradient from very pale to very dark, is exactly this. Lots of genes, each with small effects, combining and recombining in endless ways. No sharp lines, no discrete boxes, just a spectrum. But in that spectrum, a few sliders matter more than others. One of the big ones has a clunky name, SLC24A5. For a long time, nobody thought much about it. Then, in the early 2000s, researchers were studying zebrafish, little striped aquarium fish, and noticed that when this gene was altered, the fish became noticeably lighter. That got people's attention. When they looked at humans, the pattern was striking. A particular version, or allele, of SLC24A5 is extremely common in European populations and widespread in many South Asian groups. This version is strongly associated with lighter skin. Under the microscope, it changes how melanosomes, the tiny packages of pigment inside skin cells, are formed and loaded. Fewer, smaller, less densely packed melanosomes means less melanin delivered to the upper layers of the skin. The result? A lighter baseline color and faster loss of tan. Even more surprising is how young this variant appears to be in evolutionary terms. Genetic dating suggests it may have risen to high frequency in the last 10,000 to 20,000 years, during or after the last ice age, perhaps alongside the spread of early farming in Europe and parts of South Asia. Before that, even people living in Europe probably had considerably darker skin than most Europeans today. In other words, some of the whiteness we take for granted as ancient and primordial may be more like a recent paint job. SLC24, a 5 doesn't work alone. Another gene with a similar alphabet soup name, SLC45A2, also plays a major role in European pigmentation. Certain variants in SLC45A2 are associated with lighter skin, lighter hair, and lighter eyes. Like SLC24A5, this gene affects the way pigment is produced and moved around inside cells. Change the efficiency of that process, and you change how much UV-blocking melanin ends up in the skin. Then there's TYR, short for tyrosinase, the key enzyme at the beginning of melanin production. If you imagine melanin as a factory product, tyrosinase is the machine at the start of the assembly line. Turn it up, you can make more pigment. Turn it down, production slows. Rare mutations that completely knock out TYR cause certain forms of albinism, skin and hair with almost no pigment at all. More subtle variants adjust overall tone. Nearby in this same biochemical neighborhood are genes like OCA2 and its partner HERC2. These are famously involved in eye color, blue versus brown, but they also influence skin tone and hair color. They help control the internal environment of melanosomes, which in turn affects how much and what type of melanin is made. And then there's MC1R, the melanocortin-1 receptor, a small protein sitting like an antenna on the surface of pigment cells. MC1R is one of the dials that tells those cells which kind of melanin to make. There are two main forms, eumelanin, which is dark brown or black and very effective at blocking UV, and pheomelanin, which is red-yellow and less protective. In most African populations, and in many others living at low latitudes, MC1R is remarkably uniform. Almost everyone carries very similar, highly functional versions. That's a sign of strong purifying selection. Harmful or UV-vulnerable variants got weeded out over and over again, leaving a tight cluster of efficient dark melanin favoring alleles. Move into Northern Europe and the story flips. MC1R becomes a riot of variation. Dozens of different versions, many of them partially broken, less efficient at turning on eumelanin production. These loss-of-function variants shift the balance toward pheomelanin. Combine enough of them, and you get pale skin that burns easily, freckles, and in some cases the classic Northern European red hair. That fiery hair and very fair skin are not an ancient Celtic essence. They are the product of relaxed selection for UV protection in low-sun environments. Then possibly some local cultural preferences layered on top. In cloudy, high-latitude regions where vitamin D is scarce and intense UV damage is rare, the costs of having less effective MC1R drop, and quirky variants can drift and spread. Once they become common, any slight advantage, maybe more vitamin D production, maybe social or sexual selection, can nudge them higher still. So we have a picture forming. A core toolkit of pigment genes, SLC24A5, SLC45A2, TYR, OCA2, MC1R, and others like KITLG, ASIP, and MFSD12, all tweaking different steps in how melanocytes make, package, and distribute melanin. They're all present in our shared ancestral population. What changes as humans migrate into new environments is which variants become common, which fade away, and which new mutations get a lucky roll of the evolutionary dice. But here's where things get even more intriguing. For a long time, scientists assumed that lighter skin in Europe and lighter skin in East Asia must come from the same genetic changes. After all, the phenotype looks similar. Paler baseline tone, greater tendency to burn than to tan, more visible veins under the skin, lighter hair and eyes in some cases. When researchers actually compared the genomes, they found something different. Yes, there is some overlap. But many of the strongest light skin variants in Europeans, especially in SLC24A5 and SLC45A2, are either absent or much rarer in East Asians. Instead, East Asian populations show signals of selection in other genes and regulatory regions affecting pigmentation, often in ways that are still being mapped in detail. The upshot is that two major branches of humanity seem to have arrived at lighter skin through largely independent genetic routes. This is convergent evolution. The same environmental problem, limited UV, vitamin D scarcity in northern latitudes, pushing different populations towards similar solutions, but using different pieces of the genetic toolkit. It's like two cultures independently inventing bows and arrows. Same basic function, slightly different design. And it isn't just about light versus dark. Within Africa, where human genetic diversity is deepest, the story of skin color turns out to be far more complex than many once imagined. For most of the 20th century, textbooks casually suggested that dark African skin was a simple, ancestral default, shaped by strong selection near the equator and controlled by a few major genes that stayed put. Lighter shades elsewhere were often treated as deviations from that base. Then, in 2017, a large genomic study of diverse African populations, people from Ethiopia, Tanzania, Botswana, and beyond, blew that picture open. Researchers found tremendous variation in skin tone within Africa itself, from some of the darkest populations on Earth to groups with relatively light brown skin. More importantly, they found many of the key pigment variants, including some associated with lighter skin outside Africa, circulating inside Africa at substantial frequencies. In some cases, alleles thought to be uniquely European or Asian turned out to have originated in Africa long ago, only later becoming common on other continents. In other cases, variants associated with very dark skin in certain African groups had deep evolutionary roots, predating the split between modern humans and older hominin relatives. The message from this work was clear. Africa doesn't just sit at the dark end of a one-dimensional color scale. It contains much of the underlying palette itself. What we see elsewhere in the world is often a small subset of that ancestral variety, amplified or diminished by local selection. All of this brings us back to that central idea. Skin color is not a neat system with a handful of racial categories. It is a fluid, multi-gene trait, endlessly remixing. Genes like SLC24A5, SLC45A2, TYR, OCA2, MC1R, KITLG, ASIP, MFSD12, and others are important, but none of them acts in isolation. Add in regulatory switches, hormonal influences, and environmental factors like diet and behavior, and the picture gets even richer. Across 100,000 years of movement, isolation, and adaptation, a surprisingly small number of genetic levers, pulled in different combinations, generated the full spectrum of human skin tones we see today. And yet, even that is only half the story, because evolution didn't just tune skin to the sun, it also had to negotiate with culture, with beauty standards, with who chose whom as a mate. In the next part of the story, we'll watch how different populations, starting from different genetic paths, still manage to converge on similar shades, and how our ancestors' preferences about color quietly pushed evolution along. Convergent sounds like a technical word, but you already know what it means. Think of flight, birds, bats, insects. Very different animals, very different wings, all solving the same basic problem. How do you get off the ground and stay there? Evolution does that kind of thing all the time. Faced with similar pressures, it keeps rediscovering similar answers, not because it's planning ahead, but because certain solutions just work. Skin color is one of those. Once humans began fanning out of Africa, they ran into a simple but unforgiving equation. How much ultraviolet light is hitting your skin, and how much melanin do you need to balance two competing needs, protecting folate and making vitamin D? Near the equator, the answer is straightforward. UV is intense. Dark, UV-blocking skin is favored over and over again. Further from the equator, especially in cloudier, high-latitude regions, the math changes. Sunlight is weaker. The risk of folate damage drops. The risk of vitamin D deficiency rises. Lighter skin, which lets more UV pass, starts to look like a better deal. But here's where it gets interesting. Different human populations, separated by tens of thousands of years and thousands of kilometers, ran the same experiment and arrived at similar shades using different genetic tricks. Take Europe and East Asia. From a distance, if you look only at skin tone, you could imagine a single shared story. Pale baseline color, more burning than tanning. In some regions, lighter hair and eyes. For a long time, many researchers quietly assumed this meant a shared genetic origin for light skin. Then the genome work caught up. In Europe, as we've seen, variants in genes like SLC24A5 and SLC45A2 show some of the strongest signals of selection anywhere in the human genome. They swept through populations relatively recently, bringing skin from medium or deep brown to the lighter tones common today. In East Asia, you do see some overlap, certain shared alleles, some similar pathways, but the pattern is not a copy-paste. Instead, many East Asian groups show their own signatures of selection in different regions of the genome. Some affect the same pigment machinery at different points. Some tweak regulatory switches, how much, when, and where pigment genes are turned on. Others are still being identified. The result is a kind of molecular rhyme rather than a direct repetition. Two populations, both moving toward lighter pigmentation in low UV environments, but walking along mostly separate genetic paths to get there. If you zoom all the way down to the DNA, European light skin and East Asian light skin are in large part independently assembled. That's convergent evolution in action. But not every population at high latitude followed the same playbook. Look at the Inuit and related Arctic peoples in Greenland, Canada, and Alaska. These are some of the most northerly populations on Earth. For thousands of years, they've lived in environments where, for much of the year, the sun barely rises, or doesn't rise at all. If low UV automatically drove skin toward the lightest possible shades, you might expect Arctic peoples to be among the palest humans on the planet. They aren't. Traditional Inuit skin is generally darker than that of many northern Europeans, often a medium brown. That seems to break the rule. It doesn't, once you add diet to the equation. Unlike early farmers in cloudy temperate zones, the Inuit did not rely on grains grown in weak sunlight. Their traditional diet centered on marine animals, fish, seals, whales, rich in vitamin D. In other words, they were importing sunlight by mouth. If your food brings you a steady supply of vitamin D, the pressure to lighten your skin to pull more UV out of the sky eases dramatically. Darker skin can remain advantageous for protecting folate and limiting DNA damage during times of intense reflection from snow and water without compromising bone health. So, at the top of the world, evolution found a different compromise. Keep relatively high melanin, outsource vitamin D to the ocean. The same theme, local conditions matter, shows up in another direction in some of the earliest travelers out of Africa. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that ancestors of today's indigenous Australians and many Melanesian peoples left Africa very early in the great dispersal of modern humans. Some groups moved along the southern coastal route, island hopping through what is now South and Southeast Asia, eventually reaching Sahel, the ancient landmass that once joined Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania. Those regions sit under strong, often brutal sunlight. Even though these populations were far from Africa geographically, they never left the UV-rich tropics. Their skin tells that story. Indigenous Australians and many Melanesian groups have some of the darkest skin on Earth, deeply pigmented, highly protective. Yet when scientists look closely at their genomes, they find that the particular variants underlying this dark pigmentation are not identical to those common in many African populations. Different alleles, different combinations. In some cases, the same genes are involved but tuned by distinct mutations. In others, there are unique variants that arose locally and spread because they worked in that specific environment. Here again, the phenotype, the visible outcome, is similar. Very dark, UV-resistant skin. But the molecular path that led there is not simply a copy of African dark skin. It's a parallel invention, an independent rediscovery of a tried-and-true solution. When the sun is unforgiving, build as much melanin armor as you can. Even altitude adds its own twist to the story. High-altitude environments in places like the Tibetan Plateau and the Andes present a double challenge. The air is thin, oxygen is scarce, and UV levels are often higher than you'd expect for that latitude, because there's less atmosphere to filter it out, and snow reflects light upward. Tibetans and Andean highlanders have both adapted to life in the thin air, but did so in distinct genetic ways. Different genes, different physiological tweaks, same basic outcome, more efficient use of oxygen, better survival at altitude. Pigmentation rides along in this story too. High-altitude sun can be surprisingly fierce, especially on exposed faces and hands. Some Andean populations have maintained relatively darker skin than neighboring lowland groups at similar latitudes, likely as continued protection against UV. In Tibet, where many people are already part of broader East Asian pigmentation patterns, you see a mix. Lighter than equatorial populations, but still carrying protective traits adapted to strong mountain sun. Once again, the pattern is not one environment, one recipe, but one problem, several workable recipes tuned to local details. Put all of this together, and a picture emerges that is both orderly and creative. Orderly, because the same basic forces keep showing up. Where UV is intense and relentless, deep pigmentation is favored again and again. Where UV is weak and vitamin D is scarce, lighter skin finds its way to the surface, unless diet or behavior steps in to carry the vitamin D load. Creative, because the solutions are never carbon copies. Europe and East Asia lighten through partly different genetic routes. The Inuit maintain darker skin thanks to a marine pantry stocked with vitamin D. Indigenous Australians and Melanesians hold on to very dark tones using their own combinations of alleles. Highlanders adjust not just how much melanin they carry, but how their bodies breathe, circulate blood, and handle radiation from a thinner sky. Across 100,000 years, evolution acts less like an engineer with a single blueprint, and more like a tinkerer with a box of parts. It keeps pulling from the same toolkit: pigment genes, regulatory switches, dietary shifts, cultural habits, but assembles them in slightly different ways, population by population. The convergences we notice on the surface, the way distant peoples can resemble each other in shade, are the visible tip of that deeper process. And underneath all of that, another layer is quietly at work. Because these changes didn't happen in a vacuum, our ancestors weren't just reacting to sunlight and food. They were also reacting to each other, who they admired, who they feared, who they chose to have children with. To see the full story of how every skin tone on Earth came to be, we have to step into that social world, where biology and culture started negotiating over what colors would flourish and why. Up to this point, we've been talking mostly about natural selection, UV light, folate, vitamin D, DNA damage, the hard physics and chemistry of sunlight meeting skin. But your ancestors weren't just absorbing rays. They were also looking at each other. Every generation, people made choices, who to approach, who to avoid, who was beautiful, who seemed like good parent material. Those choices, repeated across thousands of years, can carve their own channels through the genome. That's sexual selection. Charles Darwin himself was bothered by this problem. In The Descent of Man, he wondered why human groups could differ so much in what he called ornamentation, skin color, hair texture, facial features, when they were all clearly the same species. His suggestion was simple, maybe too simple: local standards of beauty. If one group, for whatever cultural reason, found lighter skin more attractive and consistently chose lighter-skinned partners, those traits could expand in that population, even if they weren't especially helpful for survival. In another region, darker or more richly pigmented skin might be the admired ideal, driving selection in the opposite direction. In that view, part of our color map is history written in crushes, preferences, and quiet glances across a fire. Modern scientists are cautious with this idea. It's notoriously hard to prove. Human populations have usually faced strong environmental pressures at the same time: UV, pathogens, diet, so teasing apart "I like how you look from this keeps you alive" is tricky. But there are some hints that make choice mattered. In several regions, we see more variation in skin tone within a population than strict UV-based models would predict. Variation is the raw material of choice. If people truly didn't care about color, random mating over many generations would tend to smooth that out, especially under strong natural selection. Instead, in some places we see a persistent spectrum, lighter, darker, and everything in between, suggesting that social and sexual dynamics were helping keep that diversity in play. And then culture began to complicate things even more. For most of our deep history, skin was our main interface with the environment. Little clothing, minimal shelter. UV hit whatever wasn't covered in hair. But as human culture thickened, we started to build a second skin. Clothing came first. Even simple wraps of animal hide or woven plant fibers changed the UV equation. Cover more of the body and suddenly only the face, hands, and maybe feet are doing most of the vitamin D work. Heads get protected by hats or hairstyles. Infants are shaded. Elders spend more time near fires than out in the open. Shelter amplified this. Caves, huts, later houses with roofs and walls. All of these meant less direct sun on skin, especially at higher latitudes where people already tended to spend winters indoors. When you bundle up most of the body for warmth and modesty, pigmentation on those covered areas starts to matter less for UV protection. Natural selection's grip loosens there. Color can drift or be pulled in new directions by sexual preferences rather than sunlight. Diet joined the negotiation. We already saw how Arctic peoples use marine diets rich in vitamin D to pay off the sunlight debt, keeping darker skin in dim environments. The flip side happened further south, when humans invented farming. The agricultural revolution didn't arrive all at once, and it didn't look the same everywhere. But in many parts of Europe, the Middle East, and later parts of Asia, people shifted from diverse hunter-gatherer diets to grain-heavy staples. Wheat, barley, millet, rice, maize. Grains are excellent for calories and storage. They're not excellent sources of vitamin D. At the same time, farming altered daily life. More time bent over fields, more work done at dawn and dusk. In some settled societies, social elites might avoid heavy outdoor labor, spending more time indoors. Urbanization added another layer: narrow streets, smoke, shade. All of this created a quiet crisis in certain places: less dietary vitamin D, less UV on skin, more pregnancies, and settled, dense communities where rickets and bone deformities could become common if vitamin D levels dropped too low. Under those conditions, any genetic variant that boosted vitamin D production from limited sunlight had an edge. That could mean lighter baseline skin, or changes in how skin responds to the sun. This is one reason many researchers think the strongest sweeps for lighter skin in Europe may have happened not immediately after people arrived from Africa, but later, in the farming era. Agriculture didn't just change landscapes and social structures. It altered the nutritional background against which skin color was evolving. Similar stories may have played out elsewhere, in different forms. In some South Asian populations, for example, we see complex patterns of pigmentation shaped by a mix of tropical UV, shifting diets, and deep social structures. In East Asia, the move toward rice agriculture created its own interplay between diet, lifestyle, and sunlight exposure, helping shape the palette we see today. Meanwhile, the social meaning of skin was deepening. Once you've settled communities, stored wealth, and inherited status, people start using visible traits as quick signals of who belongs where. Clothing styles, hairstyles, tattoos, and again, skin tone. In many early agricultural societies, lighter skin became associated with people who worked less in the fields: landowners, administrators, cloistered elites, simply because they were more often indoors or in shade. Darker skin was linked to outdoor labor, heat, and manual work. In other regions, the opposite pattern emerged. Dark tanned skin could signal time spent outside, strength, or warrior status, while paleness might be read as sickness or confinement. Over generations, these associations harden into cultural beauty standards. Parents tell children what is handsome or pretty. Myths and stories encode favored complexions in gods, heroes, and lovers. People begin to alter their behavior to move toward those ideals, seeking or avoiding sun, choosing certain partners, using pigments and cosmetics to mimic a desired shade. Now the feedback loop closes. If a society treats a particular skin tone as higher status or more attractive, individuals with that tone may have better chances for marriage, more resources for their children, and in some cases more descendants. Even a small advantage, repeated over hundreds or thousands of years, can shift the genetic baseline of a population. At the same time, cultural practices like veiling, sun avoidance, or deliberate tanning can change who is exposed to how much UV, when, and on which body parts. That can subtly reshape the natural selection pressures under the surface. Biology, in other words, is not sitting passively while culture paints on top. The paint soaks in. This social layer, our stories, prejudices, fashions, and hierarchies, feeds back into which genes thrive and which quietly fade. And yet, untangling all of this is extremely hard. When scientists look at the DNA associated with skin color today, they see strong signatures of natural selection in many regions. These mutations clearly helped people cope with local sunlight, diet, and climate. They also see enormous cultural variation in how color is perceived, ranked, and desired. What we don't yet have is a clean way to say, This percentage of this allele spread was due to UV, this percentage due to sexual preference, this percentage due to social stratification. The forces overlap in time and space. They push in the same direction or in opposite directions, or trade off as cultures change. So instead of a simple answer, we get tapestry. On one thread, the physics of solar radiation and the chemistry of vitamins. On another, the quiet decisions of who to love, who to avoid, who to idealize. On a third, the slow rise of agriculture, cities, classes, and color-coded status. Together, they wove the social layer of skin, the meanings that ride on top of the melanin, even as they sometimes reshape it from below. To understand how quickly all this could happen, and why 100,000 years was more than enough time to paint the human species in every tone, from the palest ivory to the deepest ebony, we have to look at the pace of change itself, how fast genes can move when nature and culture are both lending a hand. If you've ever looked at a world map of skin tones, with its deep equatorial browns, honey ambers, olives, and pale northern pinks, you might feel a quiet skepticism rising. All of that, in just 100,000 years or so. It can sound impossibly fast. Geological change takes millions of years. Dinosaurs ruled for more than 100 million. We're talking about the time between now and the last ice age, stretched out once, maybe twice. How could nature repaint our entire species in such a short window? The answer begins with a simple, almost sleepy number, 25. Roughly speaking, that's a human generation, from your birth to the birth of your first child. In many ancient societies, it would have been less, maybe 20 years. In some later settled ones, a bit more. But if we use 25 years as a comfortable average, 100,000 years is no longer an abstract blur. It's about 4,000 generations. Imagine laying 4,000 lives end to end, mother to daughter, father to son, continuous and unbroken. Every handoff is a chance for genes to shuffle, for tiny differences in survival and reproduction to compound. Most of the time, those differences are incredibly small. Maybe one person has skin that lets them make a little more vitamin D under weak sunlight. Another person's skin protects folate just a bit better under blazing UV. By themselves, those advantages don't look dramatic. They don't make anyone invincible. They just nudge the odds. But evolution is a game that loves nudges. Suppose a particular skin color variant gives its carriers a 1% advantage in passing on their genes. Not 10%, not 50. Just one extra surviving child for every 100 births compared with everyone else. 1% is almost invisible in a single lifetime. But across 4,000 generations, it's enough to take a rare mutation, a single spark in one person's DNA, and spread it through an entire continent. Population geneticists have been running the math on this for decades. They use models with names like selective sweeps and allele frequency dynamics. Under strong selection, conditions where having the new gene really matters for health or fertility, a beneficial variant can go from essentially zero to common in as few as 100 generations. That's 2,500 years. From the perspective of geology, that's a blink. From the perspective of human storytelling, it's the distance between you and the builders of the first pyramids. Long enough for sagas and lineages and languages to rise and fall. More than enough for a skin color gene that helps babies' bones form properly, or protects mother's folate during pregnancy, to quietly conquer a population. And those 100 generations don't have to be calm and stable. In fact, they usually aren't. What really speeds things up are the rough patches. We already met one of them earlier in our story, bottlenecks. Times when a once large population gets squeezed down to a frighteningly small size by climate chaos, disease, or disaster. 1,000 people, a few hundred, maybe even fewer. In those moments, evolution stops being a slow, stately river and starts behaving more like a flash flood. With fewer individuals, random chance, what biologists call genetic drift, plays a bigger role. The neutral or even slightly disadvantageous variant can become common simply because its carriers survive the flood by luck. On the flip side, anything that offers a real advantage, even a tiny one, can shoot through the group like a spark in dry grass. There just aren't many competitors. Then, when the crisis ends and the population grows again, that new genetic profile, lighter here, darker there, more efficient at vitamin D, better at folate protection, gets amplified. The descendants of those few survivors carry that altered mix everywhere they go. This doesn't happen only in huge, species-wide bottlenecks. It also happens every time a small band of people walks away. Picture a group of maybe 50 or 100 individuals leaving their homeland, crossing a land bridge, paddling along a coast, slipping through a mountain pass into a new valley. They're not a perfect sample of the larger gene pool, just who happened to be in that group. That randomness is called a founder effect. If that little band settles down and grows in isolation, whatever traits they carried, by luck, can become the defining features of an entire region. Say that among the founders are a few individuals with a mutation that lightens skin slightly and boosts vitamin D production. In the bright tropics, that same mutation might be risky. More UV damage, more folate depletion, more miscarriages or birth defects. It would have been pruned away. But in a cloudy northern latitude where summers are brief and winters are gray, that variant suddenly shines. Babies with it are less likely to develop rickets. Mothers are less likely to suffer complications. Over time, those families have more surviving children. Within 100 or 200 generations in that new land, a handful of millennia, the lightly pigmented variant can become dominant. To later observers, it looks like a radical regional difference. Under the hood, it's just a small initial bias plus the quiet arithmetic of survival. Now stack these processes. You've repeated founder events as humans spread along coasts, up rivers, over mountain chains, onto islands. You have local bottlenecks when drought hits, when volcanoes erupt, when disease rips through a settlement. In each case, a subset of the global gene pool is sampled, squeezed, and then allowed to expand. Meanwhile, sunlight, diet, and lifestyle are changing from place to place. UV burns down near the equator. It glances weakly at high latitudes, forests, deserts, tundra, and monsoon belts. Each bring different pressures. Farming rewrites the menu. Herding shifts people outdoors with cattle or sheep. Fishing cultures spend long hours in reflected glare off water and ice. Under all these shifting conditions, skin color isn't just drifting at random. It's being pushed and pulled, sometimes gently, sometimes hard. And every time a new, helpful mutation appears, it enters a world where even a 2% edge can echo for thousands of years. But there's another layer that makes the story even more dynamic. We were not evolving alone. When modern humans walked out of Africa around 60,000 years ago, the world was already inhabited by cousins, Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans further east, and possibly other archaic groups we've only glimpsed through ghostly traces in our DNA. For a long time, people imagined sharp lines between these species. No mixing, no children in common. The genetic evidence tells a different, more intimate story. Wherever ranges overlapped, our ancestors and these other humans met, lived together for a while, and sometimes had children. Those children were fertile. Their genes flowed into our lineage. Today, most people whose ancestry traces to Europe or Asia carry a few percent Neanderthal DNA. Many people in Oceania and parts of Southeast Asia carry Denisovan DNA as well. That mixing is called gene flow or introgression, and it matters profoundly for traits like skin, Some of the Neanderthal and Denisovan variants that persist in us seem to have been useful, ready-made solutions to local environments our African ancestors were encountering for the first time. In Tibet and the Himalayas, for example, a key gene that helps people handle low oxygen at high altitude appears to be inherited from a Denisovan-like population. Melanesian and some Southeast Asian groups show Denisovan contributions in genes that may influence hair, immune function, and possibly pigmentation, helping people thrive in tropical island environments with intense sun and unique pathogens. Neanderthal DNA shows up in parts of our genome related to keratin, skin and hair structure, and in immune responses. Some of those variants probably helped early modern humans cope with colder, drier climates and new microbes beyond Africa. A few may have shaped how skin responds to UV in temperate zones, though the details are still being unraveled. So in addition to waiting for new mutations to appear, our ancestors were also occasionally borrowing alleles from cousins who had already been adapting to Eurasian conditions for hundreds of thousands of years. It's like arriving in a strange land and being handed a small starter kit. Here's how we handle this winter, this altitude, this sunlight. Put all these pieces together, and the pace of change stops looking mysterious. 4,000 generations, repeated bottlenecks and founder events, tiny but relentless selective advantages stacking up, especially when diet and UV are out of balance. And woven through it all, trickles of genes arriving from Neanderthals, Denisovans, and maybe other archaic humans, adding yet more variation for selection and culture to work with. Given that much time, that much movement, and that much mixing, the surprising thing isn't that humanity developed every skin tone on Earth. The surprising thing is that we stayed one species while we did it. Those differences you see in the mirror or on a crowded city street are the surface record of 10,000 small shifts in odds, played out over vast stretches of time. And just as important as how quickly they appeared is what came next. How those ancient encounters with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other cousins didn't just change our color palette, but helped shape the very genomes we carry today. When our ancestors finally stepped into Neanderthal country, they weren't walking into an empty, frozen canvas. They were entering someone else's home. For hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens appeared in Eurasia, Neanderthals had been there, riding out ice ages and thaws, watching glaciers advance and retreat like slow, grinding tides. By the time our species arrived, Neanderthals weren't primitive cavemen. They were seasoned locals, tough, intelligent, culturally rich, and exquisitely tuned to the lands they lived in. And in some ways, they didn't look much like us. If you could sit quietly by a Pleistocene riverbank and watch a mixed group, Neanderthals on one side, early modern humans on the other, you'd see the differences immediately. Neanderthals were stockier, broader-chested, with powerful limbs and faces built like weather-worn statues. But if you looked closer, especially at the children playing together in the dust, you'd also see something else. You'd see a shared humanity, similar smiles, similar frowns, and perhaps surprisingly a similar range of colors. For a long time, artists painted Neanderthals as uniformly pale and ruddy, a kind of default northern caveman. Then others swung the opposite way, imagining them as dark-skinned to match our African origins. The truth, revealed in fragments of ancient DNA, looks more like what we see in ourselves: variation. From a handful of Neanderthal bones, researchers have managed to read parts of their pigmentation genes. In at least some individuals, those genes carry variants associated in modern humans with lighter skin and even red hair. Not all Neanderthals, not everywhere, but enough to say with some confidence that pale skin and auburn or coppery tones were part of their palette. Other Neanderthal genomes point to darker complexions. It seems they too came in a spectrum shaped by latitude, climate, and the random role of inheritance. Some would have blended right into a modern crowd. Others would have stood out. So when Homo sapiens and Neanderthals began to meet, somewhere in the Levant, in the Caucasus, later in Europe and Western Asia, they weren't just meeting the other. They were meeting cousins with their own set of solutions to the same problems: how to stay warm, how to heal wounds, how to handle winter light and summer glare, how to wear a body under a particular kind of sky. And they didn't just exchange glances across a valley and walk away. They had children together. Those children carried a mix of both lineages, and some of their genes turned out to be extremely useful. Over thousands of years, bits and pieces of Neanderthal DNA seeped into emerging modern human populations like dye into fabric. Most of those bits don't seem to matter much. Some were probably harmful and were slowly pruned away, but a few stitched themselves firmly into our genomes, because in the places our ancestors had wandered into, they helped. Among those useful pieces are genes linked to how skin and hair form and how they handle the environment. One of the best studied is a region on chromosome 9 that includes a gene called BNC2. BNC2 is active in skin cells. In modern Europeans, a particular variant of this gene is associated with freckling and with subtle shifts in skin tone, especially in how skin responds to sunlight and how pigmentation is distributed. When geneticists traced its history, they found something intriguing. The version common in many Europeans today doesn't look purely sapiens in origin. It looks Neanderthal. Somewhere in Ice Age Eurasia, a child was born with a mix of modern human and Neanderthal ancestry. They carried a Neanderthal-style BNC2 variant, one that slightly altered the way their skin handled UV light. Maybe it changed how quickly they freckled. Maybe it fine-tuned the balance between protection and vitamin D production under cool, temperate suns. Whatever it did, in that environment, it gave just enough of an advantage that generation by generation, it spread. Not by conquest or planning, just by the quiet arithmetic of survival and reproduction. Today, millions of people with European ancestry carry that Neanderthal echo under their skin. If you've ever watched freckles bloom across a nose in summer, you've seen a whisper of that ancient encounter. And BNC2 is not alone. Other Neanderthal-derived variants show up in keratin genes that shape the outermost layers of skin, hair, and nails. Some influence how skin reacts to cold and dryness. Others touch immune pathways that help defend against unfamiliar pathogens, microbes our African ancestors had never met, but Neanderthals had been wrestling with for hundreds of millennia. Our species didn't need to rediscover all those tricks from scratch. We inherited some of them secondhand. Further east, something similar, and in some ways stranger, was happening with another group, the Denisovans. We know the Denisovans mostly from fragments. A finger bone and a few teeth in a Siberian cave, a jaw from the Tibetan plateau. No complete skeletons, no certain reconstruction of their faces, but their DNA has told us more than any skull ever could. When modern humans moved into Asia and the islands of Oceania, they encountered people whose ancestors had been there since long before Neanderthals moved west. Those people, Denisovans and perhaps related archaic groups, had solved a different set of environmental puzzles. High altitudes, for example. On the windswept plateaus of Tibet and the Himalayas, oxygen levels are low enough to make lowland visitors dizzy and sick. Yet today, Tibetan populations handle that thin air with ease. The key is a gene called EPAS1, part of the system that senses oxygen in the blood. The version common in Tibetans looks almost identical to one found in Denisovan-like DNA. It seems our ancestors met high-altitude experts, had children with them, and kept the high-altitude part of their genetic toolkit. Without that borrowed variant, permanent life above the clouds might have been far harder, maybe even impossible for Homo sapiens. In Oceania and parts of Southeast Asia, Denisovan ancestry can reach 10% or more. Some of those inherited segments are linked to immune function, some to how the body processes fats and carbohydrates, and some may influence hair and skin traits, how thick hair grows, how skin responds to intense tropical sunlight, and island pathogens. The details are still emerging. Every few years, a new study reanalyzes genomes from Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, Indonesia, or Aboriginal Australian groups and finds fresh traces of Denisovan-like DNA, often in regions with potential roles in pigmentation or skin biology. The picture is fuzzy, but the outline is clear enough to see. The colors and textures of skin in Oceania and parts of island Southeast Asia are not just a product of African origins and local sunlight. They also carry contributions from humans who were already there, who had been staring at that same burning equatorial sky long before our ancestors arrived. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps other as yet unnamed archaic populations didn't just leave ghostly footprints at old campsites. They left signatures in us. When you look at your own skin, the way it tans or burns, freckles or doesn't, glows in winter or deepens in summer, you're seeing a story with multiple authors, African ancestors shaped by intense UV and folate protection, later ancestors shaped by weak northern sun and vitamin D scarcity. And threaded through that story, quieter but still present, are the edits made by other human species, a Neanderthal tweak to a skin gene here, a Denisovan altitude variant there, little borrowed patches sewn into the fabric of Homo sapiens. What makes this especially remarkable is how new our knowledge of it is. A generation ago, if you'd asked scientists whether modern humans interbred with Neanderthals or Denisovans, many would have said no, or at least probably not much. Skin color evolution was modeled almost entirely as a Homo sapiens story, mutations arising in Africa, then spreading and shifting as our species moved. Then, around 2010, the first Neanderthal genome came online. Shortly after, Denisovan DNA was decoded from that tiny finger bone in Denisova Cave. Overnight, the narrative changed. Suddenly, we weren't an isolated lineage marching across an empty world. We were one branch in a tangled human forest, brushing against other branches, picking up leaves and twigs as we passed. Each new ancient genome, we now have Neanderthal DNA from multiple sites, Denisovan-like sequences from unexpected regions, and even hints of other unknown archaic lineages, adds another layer. Genes we once assumed were simply human sometimes turn out to have older, deeper roots, patterns in modern skin, hair, and immune systems that didn't quite make sense start to resolve. And the process is ongoing. Every year brings another surprise. A new variant traced back to Neanderthals in a pathway we hadn't connected to the environment before. A Denisovan segment turning up in a population we didn't realize had archaic ancestry. Occasionally, even a hint of gene flow from a mysterious ghost population we haven't yet identified in the fossil record. In that sense, our skin isn't just a record of what happened 100,000 years ago. It's a living archive that we're still learning how to read. Under the soft glow of artificial light, late at night, the differences between one person's skin and another's can seem purely cosmetic, almost trivial. But behind every shade is a cascade of ancient meetings. African hunters on a windy savanna, Neanderthal families huddled in a limestone cave, Denisovan children climbing high, thin-aired slopes. They all left something behind. We carry it with us every day without noticing. And as we move forward in time, sequencing more genomes, digging new caves, and refining old theories, we keep discovering just how intertwined those lives were. Our skin is not the boundary between us and the world. It's the place where our entire tangled family history rises gently to the surface. If the story ended there, with our ancestors slowly tuning their skin to local skies, borrowing a few tricks from Neanderthals and Denisovans, it would be wonderfully neat. But didn't end. We did something evolution never had to plan for. We built airplanes. We built ships that crossed oceans in weeks instead of generations, trains that streaked across continents, highways that tied distant climates together like threads. Then we wrapped our cities in glass and concrete, filled them with artificial light, and began spending most of our lives indoors. For hundreds of thousands of years, the bargain between skin and sunlight was simple. If your ancestors lived under intense UV for long enough, darker pigmentation rose in frequency. If they lived under weak UV, lighter pigmentation did. The match wasn't perfect, but it was close enough. In the space of a few centuries, an eye blink to evolution, we scrambled the board. Today you find deeply pigmented people living in places where the sun, for much of the year, barely lifts itself above the horizon. You find very fair-skinned populations in regions where the UV index regularly climbs into the red, where the light that shaped their ancestors was never meant to be. And on top of that, you find something new in human history. People of every possible shade, living anywhere they choose, regardless of what the local sky is doing. In some ways, this is a triumph. For the first time, where you live isn't strictly dictated by what your genes were selected for thousands of years ago. Medicine, clothing, shelter, and technology soften the harsh edges of climate. But it also means that the finely balanced UV bargain our ancestors negotiated with the sun is, for many of us, out of sync. One of the clearest signs of that mismatch is written not in ancient fossils but in modern medical charts: vitamin D deficiency. Vitamin D is made in our skin when UVB light hits a cholesterol-derived molecule and starts a chain reaction. Darker skin with more melanin filters out more UV. That's a huge advantage in high UV environments, where folate needs protecting and DNA-damaging rays are abundant. But it also means you need more UV exposure to make the same amount of vitamin D. For most of our history, that wasn't a problem. Dark-skinned populations in equatorial Africa, India, or Melanesia got intense sunlight for much of the year. The system worked as intended. Now picture someone with similar pigmentation moving to a northern city: London, Stockholm, Toronto. The UV is weaker, the days are shorter in winter, and modern life layers on extra barriers: clothing, long office hours, commutes underground or in cars. The skin that evolved to protect under relentless equatorial sun is suddenly starved of the light it needs to make enough vitamin D. Across Europe and North America, studies repeatedly find higher rates of vitamin D deficiency among darker-skinned groups, especially in colder climates. The consequences range from subtle, low-grade fatigue, weaker bones, a slightly more fragile immune response, to severe, including rickets in children and osteomalacia in adults. On the other end of the spectrum, very fair-skinned people, whose ancestors evolved in foggy northern latitudes where any scrap of UV was precious, now find themselves living in Australia, South Africa, Brazil, Arizona, places where the sun has teeth. This skin is exquisitely tuned to sip weak light, not to stand in front of a tropical blast furnace. In countries like Australia, whose non-indigenous population is largely of European descent, the result has been a striking rise in skin cancer. The same pale pigmentation that was once an advantage under grey northern skies now lets UV penetrate deeper, damaging DNA in skin cells. Over decades, those tiny injuries can accumulate into basal cell carcinomas, squamous cell carcinomas, and most dangerously, melanomas. Public health campaigns, Slip, Slop, Slap and its modern variants, have saved many lives. Hats, clothing, shade, and sunscreen are powerful tools. But here too, the modern mismatch shows up in unexpected ways. Because while sunscreen can dramatically cut skin cancer risk, it also filters UVB, the very slice of the spectrum we use to make vitamin D. In high-income countries, you now see vitamin D deficiency not only in dark-skinned groups at high latitudes, but also in very light-skinned people who avoid the sun almost entirely, or cover themselves obsessively. We are, in a sense, outsmarting the environment with one hand and outsmarting our own biology with the other. Layer urbanization on top of this, and the picture becomes even more complex. Our ancestors spent their days outdoors, hunting, gathering, farming, walking. The ratio of sunlit to indoor hours was heavily tilted toward the sky. Now, whether in Lagos or London, São Paulo or Seoul, immense numbers of us work inside all day and step briefly from building to car to train to building again. From the skin's perspective, it's a strange world. A quick burst of harsh midday sun on a commute. Long stretches under glass that filter some wavelengths, but not others. Even at night, our circadian systems respond to artificial light that our ancestors never knew. Into this already tangled situation, globalization has poured one more ingredient: rapid gene flow. For most of our past, neighboring populations exchanged genes slowly, through marriage networks and migration that unfolded over generations. Now someone with Norwegian ancestry and someone with West African ancestry meet at a university in Canada, have children, and those children grow up and form families with partners from India, Brazil, China, or Samoa. Pigmentation genes that once traveled mostly within local neighborhoods are suddenly mixing freely across the planet. You can already see the result in any big city. A continuous spectrum of shades and undertones, freckling patterns, tanning responses. The old rough correspondence between region and color, lighter in the far north, darker near the equator, is dissolving. If this continues for thousands of years, and there's no reason to think it won't, future humans may show even more blended pigmentation patterns. Some models suggest that, in a world of constant movement and intermarriage, extreme ends of the spectrum might become less common overall, simply because of averaging. Others note that sexual selection and cultural preferences can complicate that picture, favoring certain looks in specific places. What's clear is that the relationship between where you live and how your skin was tuned by your distant ancestors is loosening. And that brings us to an uncomfortable but important point. For much of recent history, people tried to treat skin color as if it were a deep dividing line, a way to carve the human species into rigid categories, to rank or separate, to imagine that a difference in shade corresponded to a difference in intellect, morality, or kind. Modern biology does not support that. When geneticists look across our genomes, they see that the variation linked to skin color is concentrated in a relatively small number of genes, dozens, maybe a few hundred with modest effects. But the differences between any two people are, on the whole, tiny. The same gene that lightens skin in one population might be absent in another population, with similar skin tone that arrived there through a different evolutionary path. Pigmentation is continuous, overlapping, and heavily shaped by environment and chance. Two people with similar complexions can be more distantly related than either is to a third person of a very different shade. The old races were and are social categories, not clean biological boxes. Under the microscope of population genetics, humanity looks less like neatly separated clusters and more like a set of gently shifting gradients, with skin color riding near the surface as one of many flexible traits. And yet, the story isn't finished. There is still a great deal we don't know. Researchers are now probing not just which pigment genes you have, but how those genes are turned on or off in particular environments. This is the realm of epigenetics, chemical marks on DNA and on the proteins it wraps around, influenced by diet, stress, sun exposure, even the conditions inside the womb. Some early studies suggest that chronic UV exposure can alter the epigenetic state of skin cells, changing how pigment genes are expressed without changing the underlying DNA sequence. Others are exploring how vitamin D levels, immune reactions, and inflammation might feed back into these systems. Gene-environment interactions add another layer. A variant that has almost no effect in one climate might matter a great deal in another. A tanning response that is protective in moderate UV might become harmful under extreme UV plus certain pollutants. Even today, new pigmentation genes are being identified in understudied populations, indigenous groups in the Americas, Pacific Islanders, diverse African communities whose genomes have been largely absent from early research. Each new dataset reshapes our understanding of how many different evolutionary routes can lead to similar shades. So we find ourselves in a curious position. We carry skin that was tuned by remote ancestors, living in specific places under specific suns. We live in a world those ancestors could never have imagined, full of planes, glass towers, vitamin supplements, and global cities. Our pigmentation, once a reasonably good match to our environment, is now often slightly off, or very off. But that mismatch is also an invitation to see skin color not as a verdict or a boundary, but as a story about sunlight and movement, about bargains struck and renegotiated, about how quickly evolution can act when conditions demand it, and how quickly culture can outpace it. In the end, the shade you see in the mirror is both ancient and new. Ancient because it carries echoes of savannas, forests, and ice. New because it is now moving through a world where its original purpose has been partly rewritten. And somewhere beneath all those layers, genetic, epigenetic, environmental, is a simple truth. The differences we notice most are often the ones that matter least. Underneath the shifting colors, the fused chromosome, the old bottleneck scars, we are still one small, recently evolved African species, wandering the planet together, bringing our ancestral skies with us wherever we go. And that brings us back to the mirror, to that face you know better than any fossil, any reconstruction, any diagram in a textbook. Because everything we've talked about, bottlenecks and migrations, deserts and ice sheets, Neanderthals and Denisovans, ultraviolet light and vitamins and tiny tweaks in DNA, has been quietly writing itself into the skin you're wearing right now. Once, there was just one small, struggling population in Africa, a few thousand at most, maybe fewer. They stood under a fierce equatorial sun, with melanin doing its double duty, shielding fragile folate, letting just enough light through to build bones and keep bodies running. From that single, precarious beginning, the story widened. Some descendants stayed near the old latitudes, keeping deep, UV-proof armor. Others walked north and west into Europe, where winters bit hard and pale skin became an advantage, gulping down whatever weak sunlight it could find. Others moved east into Asia, along coasts and rivers, across high plateaus and island chains, tuning their pigmentation in a dozen different ways to a dozen different skies. Along the way, they met cousins, Neanderthals in cold valleys, Denisovans in mountain passes and forests. And sometimes they didn't just compete, they loved and had children and passed on genes that still whisper in our cells. A borrowed variant here for high-altitude living. A tweak there that shifts how melanin is laid down. Chance, necessity, and affection all tangled together. Generation after generation, the palette stretched. Not in neat stripes, but in overlapping gradients, like watercolor bleeding across damp paper. Some roots to dark skin, some roots to light skin, many shades in between. The same destination reached by different genetic roads, depending on who your ancestors met, where they settled, what the sky above them demanded. And yet, through all that branching, one thing never changed. Every skin on Earth, the deepest brown, the faintest ivory, the freckled, the olive, the gold, can trace its line back to that original canvas. Back to those scattered African survivors who walked through 100,000 years of crisis and came out the other side carrying the future of our species in their bones. So when you look at another person, anywhere on this planet, you're looking at a different verse of the same story. Their shade is a record of journeys your own ancestors didn't take, climates they didn't stand under, bargains with the sun they never had to make. But beneath those differences, the script is shared. The fused chromosome, the bottleneck scars, the language genes, the old stubborn capacity for cooperation and curiosity. Skin has been used as a way to divide us. Evolution, when you follow it closely, tells the opposite tale. It says, all these colors are variations on a theme. All these tones are experiments run on the same basic blueprint. All these faces are branches of one very young species, still stretching itself across a single small world. If you're drifting towards sleep now, you might let that settle in. The thought that you, and every stranger you will ever meet, are carrying a history book on the surface of your bodies, a quiet archive of sunlight and time. If you enjoyed this journey, you can gently let the algorithm know by liking this video or subscribing so you can find your way back to more sleepy history on another night. If you feel awake enough, you might even leave a comment and tell us where in the world you're listening from, which sky, which latitude, which little corner of this shared story you're lying under. And if you'd like to go deeper into the prehistoric chapters we've only brushed against here, the bottlenecks, the vanished cousins, the near misses that almost ended us, there's a sleepy time history book waiting for you, all about those hidden beginnings. You can find it and more slow stories about our oldest secrets at sleepytimehistory.com. For now, though, you can let the details blur. Just you, your breathing, and the knowledge that your skin, whatever color it is, was written by the same long, improbable journey as everyone else's. One species, many shades, one story still being told.